Hello, welcome to Art Inquiry. I'm Hunter Drohojowska-Philp, and I'm here today with Molly Barnes, who's a curator and a collector and had one time an artist, and we're here today to talk to her about her time as an art dealer on La Cienega Boulevard during the 1960s and the 1970s. Welcome, Molly.
Thank you, Hunter. It's a treat to be here with you.
Now, we've talked about the 1960s, and it's an extraordinary time, really. Tell me about if you had to have one memory from that tumultuous and wild period, what would it be?
Rolf Nelson had a gallery at 669 North La Cienega. He, at that time, was married to Frank Gehry's sister. Judy Chicago and Lloyd Hammerall had a show in his gallery space, which was 4 feet of chicken feathers and parachute material on the walls, and people were invited to come in nude and jump in the chicken feathers. And I was working there, so I didn't get to jump in the chicken feathers, but after a week or two it began to smell. And I remember thinking, this can't be art, but it was so much fun. It was wonderful. Judy broke all kinds of rules. She was very jealous of the Finnish fetish people, all of the people who showed at the Ferris Gallery. She wanted to be like they were, like Billy L. Bankston, like Craig Kaufman, like, well, Ed Ruscha. Mm-hmm. And yet she was a woman, and it was not her place to be with those people. But she was very angry, and then she really set out on her own. She started the Woman's Building with Miriam Shapiro, and that was a place where you could learn about framing, you could learn about shipping, you could learn about everything as well as just painting in the arts. And she set off on the dinner party. And so that was she finally found her own way.
As a woman art dealer working in the art world, did you find her position sympathetic? Did you feel that she was onto something that was true and real at the time? Well,
you're younger than I am, but you probably remember what she was like. She was not really, until she started the woman's movement, where she had actually people working with her and women learning their trade and learning how to be artists by doing a lot of her work. She was very outspoken, so you really didn't think of her as a sexual woman. You thought of her as a force.
Mm-hmm. But I mean her message about equal rights and about women attaining a place in the art world, because you opened your gallery in the 1960s on La Cienega, and at that point it was hard for women to get shows at art galleries.
But do you remember, like, Nancy Reese called herself N.C. Reese, so people wouldn't get rid of her arbitrarily? DJ Hall, Debbie Hall, called herself DJ. A lot of artists had to really disguise the fact that they were women, because the feeling, well, one, women dealers love to have men. And I remember John Copeland saying to a bunch of us, we used to have drinks every day after work, Marlene Williams and Eugenia Butler. And John came in one day, he said, how do you girls pick your artists? And we said, looks. I mean, we were laughing, but it was like women loved having men. But women had a reputation then of being difficult. There was a lot of infighting. They couldn't get the education often that men could get in art schools. Parents were reluctant to send them to art schools and to pay for that. It was considered cheap. So it was very difficult for women. And I think the idea that we had to have at least one woman in our stable was, you know, something that we just accepted.
Mm-hmm. Well, was Eleanor Anton your first woman artist?
I think she was.
And then did you show others after that?
Yeah, but Eleanor was the first one, and she also didn't behave like a woman. I mean, now in Los Angeles there are 3 shows dealing with women: the one at Mocha, the one at Barnstable, and the one that's opening that Buria curated in Bergamot Station. And I can feel the difference between men and women as artists, but at that time the women, in my opinion, really emulated the men.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was going to say that I think when we walk through the show of women's art at Museum of Contemporary Art, it's called WAC, and it'll be there for many months, through the spring anyway, and into the summer. And you really get a sense of how incredibly influential the women's movement was, not just on women who were becoming artists at the time, but also on men, and the way art develops through the conceptual movement and through the post-minimalist movement, how the presence of women attaining or attempting to attain some kind of equal place in the art world really has a widespread effect. And you were there at the time. So did you get a sense of that at the time, that it was happening?
I remember going up the street from my gallery to the LA Art Association, and Lorster Feidelson was running it, and he had married Helen Lundeberg. She was a student of his, and that's why fathers didn't want their girls to go to art school, because they knew they'd end up with the non-businessman art teacher. But she was a predecessor here on the West Coast because, 1, she was a wonderful painter. 2, she learned a great deal about painting and selling from her husband. But she didn't have to worry about competing, because she was really out there. She was a forerunner. And there were a number of women like that. One of the people who really impresses me is June Wayne, who actually was a painter and then went to the Ford Foundation and asked if they would give her a grant to develop prints. And once they agreed to do that, she said, I don't want to work by committee. I only want one person here that I have to talk to. And I can't remember his name, but I remember thinking that was very smart of her. She was also a forerunner. And so I think women who are very bright got in any way they could on the West Coast here.
Well, as you have said, women as art dealers, women make good art dealers, and there's a long tradition of that as a kind of a socially acceptable commercial enterprise, even before the women's movement gained the kind of acceptance it's gained now. Did you find that that was true for you? That it seemed did you encounter resistance to your work as an art dealer as a woman, or just as an art dealer in general?
That's a very good question. When I hit on the idea of being an art dealer, I think all of my children and my parents were so happy that I had found something I really loved in life. And that kind of their support helped me a great deal. When my first backer pulled out very unceremoniously, my mother stepped in and helped me till I could get back on my feet. And my kids were always there. So it was really a family kind of thing. And I think most of the people I knew were shocked by all the shows I had, because I realized that you make a decision when you're very young to do outrageous things. And then when you're older, you can kind of settle back and pretend you're very conservative, and always have been. But I think that the trick is always to find something outrageous. And when I advise artists today, or when I did in the past, I'd always say, do something really shocking. And if you can get away with it, then later you can curl up with your family and reminisce. But I think you have to do it, because there are not enough galleries or enough art shows in the world to help and show the artists that are turned out of art schools today.
And that was probably true as well, even in the 60s and the 70s.
Oh, absolutely.
There are always more artists than there are opportunities
right.
To show. Now, did you see a change in the art world in Los Angeles between the 60s and the 70s? I mean, the 60s, looking back, seems a very incredibly lively time with the evolution of, the print movement and the pop artists and the sudden recognition of LA artists by dealers in New York. Did that continue into the 70s, or did you see a change then?
I thought there was a kind of pulling back. For example, Charles Coles, who owned Art Forum magazine, was forced to move to New York because galleries wouldn't advertise in a West Coast publication. I saw small publications open here, but they were nothing compared to the magazines in New York. And then Charles Coles moved away, and Nick Wilder died, and Irving closed the gallery, the Ferris Gallery, which was really the epitome. Mm-hmm. Jim Corcoran left. And so there was a kind of reshuffling. And then women did start coming in. La Brea became suddenly a place to show. When I was there, it was either the LA County Museum or La Cienega Boulevard, and that's where everybody went. And suddenly, Copland bought a building on La Brea and started renting out spaces, and suddenly the art world changed. Then people started going to Santa Monica and getting inexpensive places. It seems like galleries always find rundown places, move in, the artists are there, and then the land developers come in and they have to find another, I think that's what happened with Chinatown today and also Culver City in the last couple of years. But at that time I saw things kind of wane, and then all of a sudden a new crop of dealers came in. And there were a lot more women. Joan Ankrum, I remember she was next door to me. She could sell art to the mailman, he didn't have money to buy expensive art, but she knew how to do it. And I feel that a lot of the people were replaced with very strong feminine energy, and also the museums became more actively involved. There was that, what was the name of that place it was in the ABC building in Century City, and then they moved to South Robertson.
Leica?
Yeah, Leica
Yes.
was a predecessor to all the experimental and young galleries and museums that started, springing up.
Well, the LA Institute of Contemporary Art did grow out of a need because there wasn't a museum of contemporary art. For those who don't know the history of Los Angeles, the Pasadena Art Museum closed in '72. And there was no museum of contemporary art until the mid-'80s. There was so the opportunity for young living artists to show was very limited. But I always thought that's why the gallery system became strong here, because that's where the artists had to show. How long did you stay in your space on La Cienega?
I was there for about 20 years. I took a break. I pulled away for a couple of years to regroup and rethink and see my children. When you're running a gallery, you have very little time for children or a social life. I remember Roy Lichtenstein kind of cartoon on a T-shirt, and the mother is asking the daughter why she never married, and the daughter said, "I forgot," because you're so involved with your career and with the art that the only people you even seem to date are either collectors or the people who are hanging your paintings for you, or the artists. It becomes a passion. It becomes an absolute obsession.
Did you show different artists in the 70s than you had shown in the 60s?
Yeah.
Who did you show in the 70s? Who are some of what you consider Molly's highlights?
Well, I just loved when Les Levine had his show with me, where he actually poured paint on the I saw an article about him in Life magazine, and I thought, I'm going to grab him. And I made an appointment thinking it would be years away, and he said, well, we'll do it next week. And I thought, oh, this is too fast. But we did it, and he poured paint on and made a little trough. So it was an enormous project. And I remember I'm trying to think of some of the others. Bob Cottingham was a big thing for me. He was another artist that wandered in off the street. He had been an art director, and one day just said he was going to the dentist and never went back. And he painted the scenes of Los Angeles on an angle, either the old houses or the Ralph's Market or the May Company. And he was very involved with the design here in Los Angeles, which was very laconic, and he came in and he said, these buildings that are going to be destroyed are really worth looking at.
And he painted in a photorealist style.
He did.
That was kind of coming up in the 70s.
Absolutely. And I also showed Don Eddy, who at that time was painting geriatrics, people sitting on bus stops. They were like DJ halls. They were very kind of sad. And also he was doing cars, and that became fascinating to me, his work. Tom Warehol was another photorealist that I became very involved with. I showed Gronk. I read an article about him in the newspaper that he could not get a gallery show and that he had actually gone to the LA County Museum, took his paintings and burned them. And he called a press conference. So all of the newspapers were there when he burned the work. And he said, Hispanics cannot show here. And I thought, that's somebody I should get. So he was impossible to find. One, he had no last name. He had no phone. He had no car. He's still that way. But I found him, and I showed him. I had 3 shows for him. And his art was based on the sinking of the Titanic. So you were seeing this woman in beautiful clothes, a huge painting, but through the porthole you could see the icebergs, and you knew that the end was near. And now he's so successful as a designer of opera sets as well as being a real thinker in the art world. And I found that was very gratifying. Another artist who I loved was Craig Elwood, who had been an architect here. And also I saw an article about him that he was giving up architecture because it was so confining and becoming a painter. So I called him and got him to show with me, and that was amazing because he brought a whole design aesthetic. And also, when you show somebody like that who's made a name for himself in other fields, all of the pals come, and that was it was amazing to me. One person I had a lot of fun was with Martin Mull.
Oh yes,
I showed him.
Comedian.
Yeah, he came to me. Actually, his wife came to me, and she said, I probably shouldn't say this, but she said to me, "Could you show my husband?" And I said, "Sure, let me meet him." And she thought, I think, that she would be the interim, that we would never meet directly, that it would always go through her. And as soon as I met him, I mean, she was out of the picture, and she was so mad at me. She never spoke to me again, and she divorced Martin. Another person I showed was Steve Martin, the comedian. He used to buy things from me, and then one day he came in and he said, "Could I have a show here? I'll rent the gallery for you." And I was going away for the summer to East Hampton, so he rented it. And I was watching the news on NBC in New York, and I turned it on, and there was my gallery, and Steve had an invisible art show. And Bill Wilson, the then reporter for the LA Times, reviewed it seriously as the Emperor's New Clothes. And Steve just had pedestals, and then in one corner he had an unfinished piece, he called it, which was a big bowl of flowers that he changed every day.
Fantastic.
Another favorite of mine who's very, very controversial was Mark Kostabi, who one day he wandered in and he showed me some drawings. And he was a kid. He was going to school at Fullerton, and yet these drawings were very smart. They were very sophisticated, and they were simple line drawings, but they were all about life and the problems and these faceless people working out their problems with these. He was drawing them. And so I said to him, he was crazy. I mean, he was a young kid. He had spiky purple hair and zoot suit. And I said, "Why don't you just leave these drawings with me?" And he did. And all of these Hollywood people came in, Doug Kramer, I remember, and Billy Wilder, and they bought these drawings I had on the floor of the back room. And when Mark came back the next day to pick up his drawings, I said, "Maybe you could leave them. Maybe you can have a show here. Maybe we can put you in a group show." I think when you're starting a new artist, you always want to have them in a group show, either a Christmas or a summer show, to see if the rest of the artists are going to like him or her. And in Mark's case, he was always extremely controversial, but he was just so much fun. He would come and he would sit in my gallery, and I'd put him in a group show, and then he would just ask me questions about life. And I'd say, "Mark, 2 questions a day, that's all you get." He would just sit there, and you know, usually when somebody is just staring at you, you get uncomfortable. So I would say, "Mark, could you look down every once in a while? Could you sigh sagely and just ask me 2 questions?" He wanted to know everything about life. And his family were from Lithuania, from Estonia. So he had not learned a lot at home about the ways of us Americans.
Oh, that's amazing. So did you, you had your gallery for how many years altogether?
I think it was 17.
And what do you consider the high point of your, if you have a high point in your gallerist career?
I think it was seeing people change as a result of being around artists, seeing people loosen their boundaries. seeing people realize that this was something that was vital in a necessary thing.
You mean your collectors?
Yeah.
The people who came into your
the collectors. And I think in terms of the artists I showed, my reverence was always toward the abstract expressionists. My favorite artists still are the de Kooning and Rothko and Klein and Marcarelli, the people that came after that. But when I was Joan Mitchell was my neighbor in the '60s in New York, and Rauschenberg and Johns would stay with her every weekend, and they were not known yet. But what I would see was that they would sit on the beach and gossip about the art world, and I would sit down there. They didn't know who I was, but I would sit. They knew I was her friend, but I would listen to them, and they would say, "We're going to take over the art world." And I thought, these people are ridiculous, but they did. They did, and I saw them using imagery of things around us: Coke bottles, the American flag. Commercial photographs. I saw them really change the course of art history, which is what happens with every generation. But I think they were bored with the excesses of abstract expressionism and emotionalism, and they really wanted to say something else. So that was something that was very important for me to learn. And I think the experiences with John Baldessari and some of the other artists, they were just things that I'll always think about and remember and think, I was there.
Well, I think at the time that John Baldessari had his opening, I think he told me once that Joseph Kosuth was having an opening across the street.
Next door.
Next door at Eugenia Butler. So at that moment, that conceptual art is arguably born in America. It takes place on La Cienega.
Don't you think there's always
Boulevard.
a synergism that's responsible for a movement getting started? When Connie Butler talked about this show that she's curated, WAC, she talks about feeling that this is the most important art movement of the 60s and 70s. And she's tooting her own horn, but I thought that really happens when people get together, not as an individual. It happened in England with the Bloomsbury group of writers, and I think that's what happened with Baldessari and Joe Kosuth. I saw it happen. Suddenly people said, oh, we don't just have to paint on canvas. We can use our ideas as a vehicle for art. And they were very competitive, which I think is an important thing in the art world. It pushed them both.
Well, that is an underrated quality competition that these artists are. People think sometimes that artists just float around and live in another world, but really successful artists are competitive and ambitious, and that's how they feel strongly. I think you're right about furthering whatever their particular agenda might be.
At that time, I saw that it was important for artists to talk about their work. So I would try to line artists up and get them to really speak about what they were doing and why they had chosen this career and what the benefits were in terms of spiritual issues. Did they want to be rich or famous? Asking them provocative things. But I feel today the art world has totally changed, don't you? People are planning retrospectives when they're still in art school. And it's quite different. At that time, the artists were mostly poor. I remember I built a collection, helped Norman Lear, the television producer, and he was the first one to say, let's have a dinner party and have all these artists that I've met over for dinner and dancing. And it was the first time I'd seen artists really included in the adult world rather than meatloaf in the kitchen. That was a big deal for me to see that.
You knew the times had changed, and now they've really changed.
And what is it like today, do you think?
Well, I think we both agree that it's a much bigger art world than it was, but it probably hasn't changed in other ways apart from the vast amounts of money that seem to be floating around. When you were selling your art, did you have a feeling that you were ever selling for investment?
Yes and no. Martha Jackson, the dealer, told me once, don't ever sell as an investment and don't ever use that as a selling point because it'll bite you in the rear. And just get people to love the art. And if it sells for large amounts of money later, that's a bonus. And I sort of always went along with that. And then I was shocked. I bought a Don Judd for $280 to help somebody out, and it went for $1 million recently. And I saw Jess Collins that I bought for $1,200 to help Rolf with his income tax. And that was, $40,000 at an auction at the Armory in New York recently. So those things do come, and they always seem to come just when you need the money, Something will happen like that. But I never really did think of it as an investment, and I feel that's a mistake. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think it's also that people have to buy what they love and hope for the best. And if you have any last words to offer to a collector or a dealer about to enter this field, what would you say?
I would say to get good advice. I think when people start collecting art, they collect at different ages. For example, in your 20s, you and I have talked about this before, you think the art will always be there.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I can buy a de Kooning, it's always going to be available. Oh, of course, I can buy a Joan Mitchell. And then suddenly it's $1 million. And in the 20s, I think people just love the art. In the 30s, I think people are often looking for something to make them look good. When people come to their home, they want something that makes them look like they have taste. People in their 40s often are married or in a relationship, and they want something they can do with their partner. And it's fun to go to galleries at night or on Saturdays. And then people in their 50s, I think the look is more, or the feeling I get is more for spiritual. There must be something more than this. I can't remember your question.
Well,
for collectors. So I think it's important, if you don't want to look foolish, to find a dealer you trust. You can do that by really asking people who their favorite dealers are, spending time taking dealers to lunch, and finding out who they recommend. Jack Rutberg is a great person to start talking to about art. I think find a dealer who doesn't make you feel intimidated, or that you have the wrong clothes on, or you don't have the right shoes, and rely on critics, rely on people like you who write about art, and do your homework.
Well, that's fantastic advice, and you've had an incredible life in the art, and it's so wonderful to have you here today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Hunter.